Welcome to Sci-Fi Alien, the place where the unknown comes alive, and the wildest possibilities are explored. Imagine this, a human soldier, stranded on an alien planet, facing a predator so dangerous that it has destroyed entire settlements. A creature that every living being on the planet fears, the Shadow Stalker. Now, picture this soldier sitting by a fire, casually eating the very beast that's been terrorizing the land. It's hard to believe, right? But that's exactly what Lieutenant Liam Drake does. And what's even more unbelievable? He does it alone. After taking down the monstrous predator with nothing more than his combat knife and raw strength, Liam sits down, offering a piece of the beast to Serena Devara, an alien warrior sent to monitor him. Serena, stunned by his courage and audacity, asks the question that's on everyone's mind: how could a human possibly defeat something so terrifying? But that's just the beginning. Serena, having seen the strength of this human, starts to question everything she's known about her own people. As the two face an even greater threat together, a deadly betrayal from Serena's own kind, they are forced to fight not only for survival but for the truth of their alliance. Will they escape the treachery that's closing in? And what is the cost of choosing between loyalty to their people and the bond they've formed? What happens when the line between predator and prey blurs? Join us as we dive into this thrilling tale of survival, trust, and unexpected alliances. What will be their fate? Stick around to find out. In the dense, untamed wilds of an alien planet, where the sun's crimson rays painted the skies with hues of danger and mystery, there existed a creature so fierce, so ruthless, that it was known across the planet as the Shadow Stalker. With scales as black as the void, eyes that glowed like molten gold, and an agility that made it nearly invisible in the shadows, this apex predator had earned its title through sheer terror. Entire settlements had been wiped out, their warriors defeated without mercy, and even the bravest of species trembled in its presence. The Shadow Stalker was a living nightmare, an unstoppable force of nature that no one dared challenge. For centuries, the people of this alien world had adapted their entire existence around the fear of this creature. Hunting in packs, relying on stealth and strength, the Shadow Stalkers stalked the forests, their haunting growls echoing through the night, sending chills down the spine of anyone who heard it. To even see one was a death sentence. No one had ever defeated one in single combat. No one had ever dared to. And yet, here he was. Lieutenant Liam Drake, a human soldier stranded far from Earth, sat casually by a crackling fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. The air around him carried the sharp scent of roasting meat, and as the fire danced, the shadows stretched long across the barren landscape. It was hard to imagine that just hours ago, he had been locked in a life-or-death struggle with the very creature that had haunted the planet's inhabitants for generations. The Shadow Stalker, the one that had been terrorizing the planet for centuries, was now roasted and split open before him, the massive leg of the beast skewered over the flames. Liam tore into the meat with relish, the juices dripping down his chin as he savored the rich, gamey flavor. It was almost as if he were enjoying a casual meal after a long day's work. His calmness, his complete lack of fear in the face of such a notorious predator, was unsettling. His movements were unhurried, the expression on his face one of pure contentment, as if sitting by a fire and eating a giant creature was the most natural thing in the universe. The air was thick with the aroma of roasting flesh, the crackling of the fire almost hypnotic, and the flames cast an eerie glow on Liam's face. His gear, scratched and dented from the battle, lay discarded nearby, and his black combat suit was torn in several places, revealing fresh scrapes and bruises. But the wounds hardly seemed to bother him. He was alive. And he had won. Just as he was about to take another bite, movement caught his eye. At the edge of his camp stood a figure, a silhouette framed by the dying light of the day. Serena Devara, the warrior from the Nixon species, took a hesitant step forward. Her silvery white hair shimmered in the low light, forming a halo around her sharp, elegant features. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, locked onto the sight before her. She had come to check on him, to assess his survival, but this was something beyond anything she had ever imagined. Serena was a warrior, strong, proud, and fearless in battle. But even she could hardly comprehend what she was witnessing. The Shadow Stalker had always been the apex predator. It was the stuff of nightmares, a creature that preyed on the weak, an untouchable force of nature. But now, here it was, its massive form reduced to nothing more than dinner for a human, a species that had always been considered fragile by her kind. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, scanned the scene. The creature's massive leg, nearly the size of a small elephant, was skewered on a makeshift spit, slowly turning over the fire. She had heard the legends, of course. The stories of the Shadow Stalker's strength, its ferocity. She had heard that it was impossible to defeat in combat. And yet, here it was, cooked, and ready to eat, with Liam Drake casually tearing into it like a seasoned hunter. In that moment, everything she thought she knew about her world, her people, and even her own place in the universe seemed to shatter. What are you eating?" Serena managed to ask, her voice shaky, her heart racing. She could hardly believe her own words, as though the very act of speaking them made the reality of what she was seeing harder to grasp. How could it be? How could this human, this outsider, be sitting here, feasting on the most dangerous creature she had ever known? Liam grinned up at her, his teeth flashing in the firelight. He wiped the juices from his chin, unbothered by the surprise in her voice. "Dinner," he said simply, holding up the leg of the creature. "Want some? It's actually pretty good. Tastes like a mix of venison and buffalo, I'd say." Serena stood frozen, her gaze fixed on him, struggling to process the impossible. The fearsome Shadow Stalker, reduced to a meal. She had come here to monitor this human soldier, but never in her wildest imagination had she thought she would witness something so audacious, so impossible. The stories, the warnings, the years of living in fear, all of it seemed like a lie in the face of what she was seeing now. This human, with his ragged clothes, his battle-worn appearance, and his unflinching demeanor, had somehow bested the beast. Not only had he bested it, but he had turned it into food. Serena's mind raced. She was no stranger to battle. She had seen death. She had fought in wars. But this was different. This wasn't just survival. This was something else. She couldn't understand it, but she couldn't look away either. There was a question she had to ask. "How did you defeat it?" she asked, still struggling to grasp the reality of the situation. Liam leaned back, grinning wider now, clearly enjoying the effect his words had on her. "Well, I didn't have much of a choice, did I?" he said, his voice casual. "I ran out of plasma charges while I was clearing the perimeter, so it came down to good old-fashioned hand-to-hand combat." Serena blinked in disbelief. "You fought the Shadow Stalker, with no weapons?" "Pretty much," Liam replied, wiping his hands on his pants. "It was tough, I'll admit. But like I said, you have to adapt. If you want to survive out here, you've got to be prepared for anything. And sometimes, that means getting up close and personal." Serena's mind raced as she processed what he was saying. A creature that had wiped out entire civilizations, fought off the most skilled warriors, had fallen to a human soldier armed with nothing but his fists. It defied everything she had been taught. It defied everything her people had believed about the limits of their strength and the capabilities of humans. The doubt and disbelief she felt turned into something else, a deep, unsettling respect. The human in front of her wasn't weak. He wasn't just some soldier lost in the wild. He was something else. Something that defied her understanding. How are you so sure? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How are you so sure that you can fight something like that? Liam shrugged, leaning back against a rock and gazing into the fire. Because where I come from, we don't wait for things to happen. We make them happen. It's about knowing when to fight, when to hold back, and when to keep pushing. Even when the odds are stacked against you. Serena was silent for a long moment. She had always known strength in battle, but she had never seen it like this. There was a quiet, almost unsettling confidence in his words. It wasn't cockiness, it was a truth. A truth she hadn't understood until now. It was in that moment, with the fire crackling softly between them and the roasted remains of the shadow stalker in front of them, that Serena understood something she had never considered before. The world was not what she had thought. Humans were not what she had thought. And she was no longer sure what was real. But what she was sure of, in that instant, was that Liam Drake was not someone she could simply dismiss. The fear she had felt was not just fear of the creature. It was fear of what he represented. The unknown. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. After witnessing Lieutenant Liam Drake casually devouring the very creature that had terrorized the planet for centuries, Serena Devara stood in stunned silence. The firelight flickered in her eyes, the scent of roasted meat mingling with the heavy air of the alien wilderness. Her mind raced as she tried to comprehend what she had just witnessed. Liam, a human soldier, sitting unbothered, eating the apex predator of this planet. The creature that had once been the embodiment of death and destruction was now reduced to nothing more than a meal. Serena, like every other inhabitant of this world, had lived in constant fear of the shadow stalker. It was a creature of nightmare, a relentless hunter, a beast that could take down entire communities without a second thought. Its obsidian scales and razor-sharp claws had turned it into an unstoppable force, and anyone who dared to challenge it met a brutal and certain death. So how could this human, someone so vastly different from her people, have done the impossible? She had come to the camp to assess Liam's situation, to monitor his survival on this alien world, but she had not expected to see what she was seeing now. What kind of person could defeat a creature like that with nothing but his bare hands? What kind of human was he? As the moments passed, her thoughts shifted from disbelief to curiosity. There was something more to Liam than just his physical strength. Serena was no stranger to warriors. She had spent her entire life in combat, defending her people, training for battles with creatures that were far less formidable than the shadow stalker. But this human, this stranger, had done what no one else had ever dared, let alone achieved. He had survived against the odds, not just through strength, but through sheer willpower. It wasn't just that Liam had fought and killed the shadow stalker, it was the way he had done it. He hadn't relied on overwhelming force or advanced technology. He hadn't used any of the weapons that her people would have used in a similar situation. He had used his wits, his adaptability, and his unyielding resolve. Serena had seen warriors battle to the death before, but never like this. This human had turned survival into an art. Liam, noticing the way Serena was watching him, leaned back casually on a nearby rock, his eyes reflecting the flames of the fire. He wiped his hands on his torn suit and smiled at her, as though he had just finished a casual meal after a day's work. "It wasn't easy, I'll tell you that much," he said nonchalantly. "But nothing ever is, right?" Serena was still processing what he had said. "How did you do it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question had been on her lips for a while now. She had heard the stories, the warnings about the shadow stalker. She had seen the devastation it had caused. So how could this human, this outsider, have succeeded where so many had failed? Liam's smile faded slightly, his expression turning thoughtful for the first time. He seemed to consider her question for a moment before responding. "I didn't beat it," he said slowly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "I survived. I adapted. That's what we do, where I come from." His words hung in the air, and Serena felt a shift in the atmosphere. What he was saying wasn't just about the physical fight, it was about something deeper. It was about resilience, the ability to adapt when faced with an impossible situation. Serena's entire life had been built around the idea of strength, of dominance over one's enemies, but Liam was showing her something different. He wasn't just strong in the traditional sense, he was strong because he could bend with the winds of adversity without breaking. "You humans," she said, her voice low, filled with wonder and a touch of awe, "you don't rely just on your strength. You adapt." She repeated the word he had used, and for the first time, she began to understand what he meant. His strength wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional, and tactical. He was a survivor, not because of his power, but because of his ability to endure, to learn, to change. Liam nodded, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that surprised her. "Exactly," he said. "We don't have the speed or strength of other species. We're not born with special abilities or natural weapons. But what we do have is determination. We find a way, even when it seems impossible. We don't just fight the enemy in front of us, we fight the circumstances, the environment, the odds themselves. And we make it work." Serena was quiet for a moment as she processed his words. She had always thought that victory came through sheer power, through brute force and overwhelming strength. But Liam was showing her that there was more to it than that. There was a strength of will, a determination that didn't just rely on muscle. It was about outthinking your opponent, using the environment to your advantage, and never accepting defeat. She found herself drawn to him, not just as an ally in this foreign land, but as someone who had survived where others had failed. He wasn't just a fighter. He was a strategist, a tactician, a man who understood the value of adaptation in a world that was anything but predictable. But it wasn't just his intelligence or his strength that struck Serena, it was the quiet confidence that radiated from him. He didn't boast about his victory, he didn't brag or show off. He simply was. There was no need for bravado because Liam knew who he was and what he was capable of. It was a type of strength Serena had rarely encountered, one that was rooted in humility and quiet certainty. "You really aren't afraid, are you?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Liam's expression softened, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Fear's a natural thing. It keeps you sharp. But it doesn't control me. If you let fear control you, you've already lost the fight." Serena felt a flicker of admiration stir within her. Fear had always been a tool she used to fuel her strength. It kept her cautious, kept her alert. But Liam was right, fear could also be a prison, something that limited you. She had been taught to use fear to dominate her enemies, but now she realized that fear didn't need to control her. It could fuel her, but it didn't have to define her. As the night deepened, Serena found herself thinking more about what Liam had said. There was a strength in him that went beyond the physical. It was a kind of survival instinct that resonated with her in a way she hadn't expected. It was the ability to keep moving forward, even when the world seemed to be against you. It was about finding the cracks in the armor, the gaps in the battlefield, and exploiting them, not just with force, but with intelligence, resilience, and the will to adapt. Serena had always believed that survival was about being the strongest, about being the one who could overpower the opposition. But now, as she sat by the fire, watching Liam finish his meal, she realized that strength came in many forms. His strength wasn't in his muscles or his weapons, it was in his ability to face impossible odds, to bend with the wind and find a way through. Liam Drake was not just a fighter. He was a survivor, a living testament to the power of adaptability, mental fortitude, and relentless will. And Serena knew, in that moment, that she would learn much more from him than she had ever imagined. Her world had just shifted, and she wasn't sure whether she was ready for the change. But one thing was clear, Liam had shown her a new way of surviving. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most important lesson of all. In the dim light of the dying fire, Serena Devara couldn't help but look at Lieutenant Liam Drake in a new light. What had started as an assignment to observe and monitor this human soldier, this outsider, had slowly evolved into something more, a bond that neither of them had expected. A bond forged in the heart of battle, in the midst of survival, and now, amidst the quiet tension of the night. Serena had always been a warrior, trained from birth to fight, to protect, to survive. Her people, the Nixons, were fierce in battle, disciplined and strong. They were hunters, leaders, and protectors of their world. Fear was a tool, a powerful motivator that kept them sharp, kept them cautious. But here, in the presence of this human, Serena was beginning to question everything she had believed about strength and survival. Liam was not like the others. His power, his strength, was not just physical. It wasn't the strength of a warrior who relied on years of battle training, nor the strength of someone who could overpower their opponent with sheer force. No, Liam's strength came from something deeper, a quiet confidence, a resilience that refused to be broken by the odds stacked against him. He adapted. He learned. And in his presence, Serena felt her own understanding of what it meant to be strong beginning to shift. She sat beside him by the fire, the warmth of the flames flickering between them. The air was still, heavy with the weight of their conversation. In the silence, she could hear the sound of her own thoughts, racing and tumbling over each other. How had she come to trust him? How had this human, this soldier from another world, become so important to her in such a short time? "I've fought alongside many warriors in my life," Serena said, her voice quiet but filled with sincerity. "But I've never fought alongside someone like you. You're different." Liam glanced at her, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. There was no arrogance in his expression, no smugness. Instead, there was something unspoken in his eyes, a shared understanding of what they had been through together. His lips curled into a small, knowing smile, one that spoke of battles fought and victories earned, but more importantly, of the journey that had brought them to this moment. "You're not the first to say that," he said with a hint of humor in his voice. "But I've fought alongside my fair share of warriors, too. The thing is, it's not always about how strong you are or how skilled you are. Sometimes, it's about who you're fighting for. And sometimes, it's about who you're fighting with." Serena's heart tightened at his words. She had never considered the idea of fighting for someone beyond the mission, beyond the duty. She had always fought for her people, for survival. But with Liam, something felt different. She had seen how he fought, calm, focused, adaptive, and she knew it wasn't just about the victory. It was about the bond that had been forged in the process. She wasn't just his ally anymore, they weren't just two people fighting for survival on the same planet. They were partners. You said before that humans don't rely on their strength, but on their ability to adapt, she said, her voice steady but thoughtful. And now I see it. You're not just surviving, Liam. You're thriving. You don't just fight against the enemy. You fight with them, alongside them. You make them better. Liam's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, he looked away, as if processing the weight of her words. He had never thought about it like that. For him, survival had always been about pushing forward, adapting to the ever-changing circumstances. But in Serena's words, there was a truth that he had never fully recognized. He wasn't just surviving. He was building something that went beyond mere existence. He turned back to her, his blue eyes meeting her purple ones, a quiet understanding passing between them. I think that's what makes us different. Where I come from, we've learned that to survive, you don't just rely on your own strength. You rely on the people around you. The ones who have your back. The ones who challenge you, push you, help you grow. Without that, without trust, we don't stand a chance. Serena felt a wave of emotion surge within her. She had always been taught that strength came from the self, from within. But Liam's words made her question everything. His strength didn't just come from his body, from his training, it came from something else. Something that was shared, something that connected him to others. To her. I've never trusted anyone the way I trust you, Serena confessed, her voice barely above a whisper, her words raw with emotion. The admission surprised her, but in this moment, it felt right. The trust between them had been built slowly, through battle, through shared experiences, through the unspoken understanding that they needed each other. And somehow, that trust had grown deeper, more powerful than anything she had ever known. Liam didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. The silence between them spoke louder than words ever could. He reached out then, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, a simple gesture, but one that meant everything. The weight of his hand, the strength of it, was a promise. A promise of loyalty. Of partnership. Of a bond that couldn't be broken. You're not alone, Serena, Liam said, his voice low and sincere. Not anymore. Not as long as I'm here. Serena closed her eyes, feeling the heat of his hand on her skin. She had never thought she would find someone like him, someone who could challenge her worldview, someone who could stand beside her, not just as an ally, but as a true partner. Together, they had survived the impossible. Together, they had faced the deadly predators of this world and conquered them. And together, they would face whatever came next. The fire crackled between them, the flames dancing in the stillness of the night. But for Serena, the warmth of the fire was nothing compared to the warmth of the connection she felt with Liam. It was a bond that had been forged through blood, sweat, and shared survival, a bond that would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. She realized, in that moment, that this wasn't just a partnership of convenience. It was something deeper. Something that had grown from the most unexpected of places, two people from different worlds, learning to trust each other, to adapt, to fight together. They had gone from being allies to something more, something unspoken, something that didn't need to be said, because they both understood it perfectly. And as the night stretched on, Serena knew that she had found something worth fighting for. Not just for her people, but for the one person who had become her partner in every sense of the word. They were no longer just two individuals battling to survive on a hostile world. They were a team, stronger together than they could ever be apart. In the end, survival wasn't just about defeating the enemies they faced. It was about learning to face the world together, hand in hand, with trust, strength, and a shared determination to make it through, no matter the odds. And Serena knew that with Liam by her side, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. The distant sound of growls broke the fragile peace of the night, and Serena's instincts snapped into place. Her heart quickened, but her training held her steady. She stood, her body moving fluidly, a warrior's readiness taking over. The air, which had been thick with the warmth of the fire, now felt dense with an impending danger. Liam stood next to her, his posture calm but his eyes scanning the darkened forest around them. There was no panic in his movements, only that quiet, deliberate focus that she had come to respect so much. In the span of a few days, she had come to realize that his calm in the face of imminent threat was more powerful than any weapon. He was a survivor, and he exuded a strength that transcended physical power. "Pack," Serena said, her voice low but urgent. She could feel the weight of the situation in her chest. The Shadow Stalkers weren't just one creature. They were a pack, a deadly force that hunted together, worked together, and killed without mercy. Liam nodded, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his combat knife. His plasma pistol was still holstered, but it was clear to Serena that he wasn't planning to rely on his weapons alone. This wasn't just about survival, it was about survival together. She realized in that moment that they weren't just allies. They were a team, united by the necessity of the fight, and the bond they had formed in the face of so much danger. The growls grew louder, closer. And then, from the shadows of the trees, the first shadow stalker emerged, its obsidian scales glistening in the dim light of the fire, its glowing eyes fixed on them with the primal hunger of a hunter. It was massive, easily twice the size of any creature Serena had ever encountered. But the sight of it, though terrifying, didn't make her hesitate. She knew what was at stake. "Stay close," Liam whispered, his voice steady, though Serena could hear the underlying tension. In a fluid motion, he drew his blade and moved toward the beast, his steps purposeful. Serena followed suit, her weapon drawn, her body shifting into the perfect stance of a hunter. She was no stranger to battle, but the sight of the Shadow Stalker, with its menacing size and speed, made her pulse spike with the recognition of what they were facing. A creature that had killed countless warriors, a predator that had turned entire settlements into ghost stories. The pack emerged from the shadows, their growls turning into deep, resonating roars. 3 more creatures slunk out of the trees, their eyes locking onto Serena and Liam. They were closing in fast, their movements calculated, swift. Serena could feel the heat of their breath as they neared, and her senses sharpened. She wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. She was fighting for both of them. The first Shadow Stalker lunged toward Liam with terrifying speed, its claws slashing through the air. But Liam was already in motion. He ducked, twisting his body with an agility that Serena hadn't expected from someone of his size. He sidestepped the creature's attack and slashed at its side, his blade cutting through its armor with a precision that stunned her. Serena took the opening he created, moving with a grace that made her seem like a shadow herself. She was fast, but she was also measured. Every movement was calculated, designed to conserve energy, to strike with purpose. Her blade flashed as she met the second shadow stalker, her feet light as she sidestepped its deadly claws. She jabbed her weapon into its side, her face set in determination. It howled, a sound that vibrated through the ground, but it didn't fall. Not yet. Behind them, the third creature moved to flank. Serena could hear its heavy breathing as it closed the distance between them. She moved to counter, but in that moment, she felt Liam's presence behind her. Without a word, he was there, right where she needed him. He lashed out with his blade, drawing the creature's attention away from her. Serena felt a rush of gratitude. This wasn't just about fighting side by side anymore. This was about trust. In a fight like this, where the stakes were nothing less than life and death, trust was everything. The battle was chaos, claws and teeth, speed and ferocity, the raw power of the predators clashing with the sharp, determined precision of the humans. But even in the chaos, they moved as one. Liam and Serena had found a rhythm between them, their actions coordinated, their timing flawless. They were learning to fight not as individuals, but as a singular force, driven by a shared will to survive. Liam's eyes never left the creatures. His every movement was deliberate, his strikes purposeful. There was no hesitation in him, no panic. The fear that Serena had once seen in her own reflection, fear of the unknown, of being outmatched, seemed to be absent in him. In its place was something else, confidence. Not the arrogance of someone who thought they were invincible, but the quiet assurance of someone who knew their limits and was unafraid to push them. The first shadow stalker fell. It let out a deafening cry as it collapsed, its massive body crashing to the ground. Serena's chest heaved as she caught her breath, but there was no time to celebrate. The other two were still moving, still fighting with all the strength they had. But Serena was no longer afraid. She wasn't thinking of herself, of her people, of her planet. She was thinking of Liam. Of them. The fight had shifted from a battle against the creatures to a battle for each other. As the second shadow stalker lunged, Serena threw herself into its path, her blade finding its mark in the creature's underbelly. It screeched and staggered back, but it was too late. The opening had been made, and Liam was there in an instant, his combat knife slicing through the creature's throat with a single, clean strike. The last one. Serena didn't need to look to know that Liam was there. She didn't need to call out his name or give any instructions. The bond between them was solid now, unspoken, but undeniable. She could feel him move to her side, and together, they turned toward the final shadow stalker. It was bigger, faster, and it was ready to fight to the death. But so were they. Serena moved to the left, her movements fluid, drawing the creature's attention. It lunged at her, but she was ready. With a swift movement, she ducked and rolled, coming up behind it. Liam was already there, his blade sinking into the creature's side as it tried to turn. They fought together, their motions in perfect synchrony as they wore the creature down. With one final, devastating strike, the beast fell, its body collapsing in a heap on the ground. Silence descended. Serena stood over the creature, her breathing heavy, her body drenched in sweat. Her chest ached, and the adrenaline that had coursed through her veins moments ago was beginning to fade, leaving behind the weight of exhaustion. But she didn't feel fear. She didn't feel dread. She felt something she hadn't expected, gratitude. Gratitude for having fought alongside someone like Liam. He wasn't just a human soldier, he was a partner. A partner who had stood by her side, not just in battle, but in every moment of this shared experience. Liam was breathing heavily as well, but he didn't look tired. He looked content. He didn't wear the smile of someone who had won. He wore the look of someone who had done what was necessary. Not bad for a human, huh? He said with a small grin, wiping the blood from his blade. Serena didn't reply right away. She was still processing everything, the battle, the moments between them, the growing understanding of what they had just accomplished. She had fought, yes, but this battle was different. This fight hadn't been about survival. It had been about trust. "You've proven a lot more than that," she said finally, her voice soft but filled with an emotion she couldn't fully articulate. "You've proven what it means to survive together." Liam looked at her, his gaze steady, his eyes filled with something she couldn't name. It wasn't just pride in victory. It was something deeper. Something that only those who had fought side by side could understand. Together, they had not just survived. They had won, as a team. And that was the kind of strength that could face anything. The silence that followed the battle was unlike anything Serena had ever known. It was the kind of silence that settled deep into the bones, a quiet after the storm, heavy with the weight of everything that had transpired. The shadow stalkers were dead, their massive bodies sprawled out across the ground, the remnants of their vicious attacks now nothing more than echoes in the night. But Serena didn't feel the triumphant relief that usually followed victory. Instead, she felt something else. She felt connected, to the man standing beside her, to the world around her, to the bond that had grown between them in the midst of chaos. A bond that had been forged not just through their shared struggle for survival, but through something much deeper. Something that had come to define this unexpected partnership: trust. The air around them still carried the smell of the battle, blood and dust mixed with the distant scent of the alien vegetation. The fire that had once danced between them now burned lower, its flickering light casting shadows across their faces. Serena stood still, her chest rising and falling with each labored breath, but the exhaustion wasn't the only thing weighing on her. It was the quiet realization that, in the middle of that fight, she had relied on Liam in a way she never had with anyone before. Not just in battle, but with her very life. As the adrenaline began to ebb, Serena's mind shifted from the immediate need to survive to the deeper question that had been growing within her ever since she'd met Liam. How had she gone from seeing him as a mere soldier, a human to be monitored, to seeing him as someone she couldn't imagine facing the world without? She glanced at him, and found him looking at her with a similar, almost unreadable expression. His body, bruised and bloodied from the fight, was still standing tall, his posture strong. But there was something more in his eyes now, something that spoke not of survival, but of understanding. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, as she had seen him at his. Their connection had grown in ways neither of them had expected, not just because of the battles they had fought together, but because of the way they had learned to trust each other implicitly. Liam had never been just a soldier in Serena's eyes. He had become a partner, a person who, despite being from a completely different world, had proven time and again that his strength wasn't just in his physical ability to fight, but in his ability to adapt, to listen, and to move forward with a quiet determination that made him more than human. "I thought you were going to get yourself killed," Serena said, her voice lighter now, almost teasing, but the edge of concern still lingered. Liam chuckled softly, wiping the blood from his hands on his pants. "Guess you were wrong about that," he said with a grin, his eyes glinting with a mixture of humor and something deeper, something that spoke of their shared experience. "You didn't do too badly yourself." She smiled in return, but it wasn't just a smile of acknowledgement. It was the smile of someone who had come to trust another person more than they had trusted anyone in a long time. A smile that spoke of a bond that had transcended mere survival. The battle had changed something in both of them. They had fought side by side, and not just as comrades, but as people who had come to rely on one another in the most profound ways. For the first time since they had met, Serena realized that Liam was no longer just a soldier from another world. He was her partner, a partner she trusted with her life. They sat down by the remnants of the fire, their bodies bruised and battered, but their spirits stronger than ever. The night around them was quiet, the stars above casting their distant light on the battlefield. They were no longer just two people thrown together by circumstance, they were two people who had forged something out of nothing. For Serena, this was a new reality. Back home, her people had always been independent, self-reliant. Trust was something that was earned, something that took time. It was something that was carefully guarded, never easily given. Yet, with Liam, the trust had come quickly, because he had earned it not through words, but through actions. It was in the way he had fought, the way he had acted without hesitation to protect her, the way he had placed his trust in her despite everything they had been through. Liam's presence had never felt like a burden. It had felt like a gift, something she didn't know she needed until it was right there beside her. In the past, Serena had relied on herself, on her strength, on her ability to fight. But now, as she sat beside him, she realized how much stronger she had become, not just through her own will, but because of the connection they had formed. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer heavy with tension or the strain of battle. It was the kind of silence that only came when two people knew each other deeply, when they had shared not just their victories, but their fears and their vulnerabilities. Liam looked over at her, his face still shadowed by the firelight, but his gaze steady and warm. "You know," he said slowly, "back where I come from, they tell us that we're not supposed to trust easily. That we're supposed to keep our guard up. I don't know how it works where you come from, but," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "I trust you, Serena. In a way that I don't think I've trusted anyone in a long time." The words hit Serena harder than she expected. There was something about them that resonated deep within her, something that touched a part of her she hadn't even known was there. She turned to him, meeting his eyes, and for the first time, she allowed herself to fully acknowledge the bond that had been growing between them. "I trust you, too," she said softly. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that neither of them could ignore. In that moment, it wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about fighting the enemy or facing danger together. It was about the connection they had forged. A connection that had transformed them from mere allies to something more, something deeper, something stronger. They had survived the battle, yes, but more than that, they had learned to trust each other in ways neither of them had expected. The fire crackled softly between them, the night stretching on. But Serena didn't feel alone. Not anymore. The connection they had formed, born of blood, sweat, and shared survival, was unbreakable. No matter what came next, she knew that together, they could face it. They had crossed a threshold, one that went beyond the physical and into the realm of true partnership. And that was something worth fighting for. In the quiet aftermath of battle, as the world around them slowly began to settle into its rhythm, Serena realized that the most powerful strength wasn't the ability to fight. It was the ability to trust, and that was something she had found not just in herself, but in Liam. And as long as they had that, there was nothing they couldn't face. Nothing they couldn't survive together. The stillness of the night was a fragile illusion, a momentary reprieve from the chaos that had been their lives for the past few days. Serena and Liam sat close to the remnants of the fire, the flickering glow casting long shadows on the ground. Their breathing had slowed, the adrenaline of the fight now giving way to the deep exhaustion that only came after a battle for survival. The tension that had once gripped them was now replaced with a quiet, almost peaceful calm. But beneath that calm, a nagging unease began to stir within Serena. She had spent her entire life in the wilderness, navigating threats that came in many forms. But this was different. The connection she shared with Liam, the trust they had built, had made her feel invincible, at least for a moment. But even that sense of security felt fleeting now. The night, so still and quiet, seemed to hum with an unsettling energy, as though something was lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight, waiting to strike. Her instincts, honed by years of survival, told her that this calm wouldn't last. And she wasn't the only one who felt it. Liam had been unusually quiet, his eyes scanning the shadows of the surrounding trees with a wariness she hadn't noticed before. The fire crackled softly, but the familiar sounds of the jungle, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of distant creatures, seemed to have faded into an eerie silence. "Liam," Serena whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "Do you feel it? Something's not right." He didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the darkness, his posture alert, as if he, too, had sensed the shift in the air. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke, his voice low but filled with the gravity of the moment. "I know," he said, his eyes narrowing. "I don't think we're alone anymore." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and Serena felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. It wasn't the shadow stalkers this time, but something else. Something human. The sense of unease that had been gnawing at her now crystallized into something far more dangerous. Before she could respond, the sound of movement came from the shadows, faint at first, then growing louder, unmistakable. Serena's hand instinctively went to her weapon, her body tensing as she rose to her feet, her eyes darting in search of the source of the disturbance. Then, from the darkness, figures emerged. Their faces were obscured by hoods, their bodies wrapped in dark, unfamiliar armor that gleamed coldly in the moonlight. The first figure stepped forward, and Serena's stomach tightened with the recognition she had hoped never to experience. Reuven. The Nixon commander, the very one who had sent her to monitor Liam, stood before her, a cold smirk playing at the corners of his lips. Behind him, a group of Nixon soldiers flanked him, their weapons drawn and their expressions unreadable. Serena's blood ran cold as she took in the sight of them, standing in the moonlight like predators ready to strike. Liam immediately moved to her side, his body instinctively shifting to protect her. His hand rested lightly on his combat knife, his gaze fixed on Reuven and his soldiers, calculating, measuring the danger they posed. Serena's mind raced, the questions flying at her in rapid succession. What was Reuven doing here? Why had he brought soldiers? And why did they look at her with such disdain? "You're supposed to be monitoring, not betraying." Reuven's voice was low, dripping with a venomous edge that made Serena's chest tighten. "You failed, Lieutenant D'Ibarra. You've let this human soldier interfere with the plans we've set in motion." Serena's pulse quickened as she processed his words. Betrayal. What was he talking about? She had been sent to observe Liam, yes, but nothing more. She had never intended to go against her people. But the deeper connection she had formed with Liam, the trust they had built, was this what Reuven had feared? Had he seen their bond as a threat to his own control? You should have stayed loyal to your people, Rowan continued, his voice colder now. But now, you've gone too far. You've crossed a line, Lieutenant. And there are consequences for that. Liam stepped forward, his posture defiant, his voice cutting through the tension in the air. You're not going to intimidate her, he said, his tone calm but unwavering. And you're sure as hell not going to intimidate me. Rowan's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was the smile of someone who knew they had the upper hand. You really think you can stand against us? You, a lone human, against the might of the Nixon Empire. His eyes flicked to the soldiers behind him. The decision has been made. The Nixon Council won't tolerate this, won't tolerate you. The air crackled with tension, and Serena could feel the weight of Rowan's words pressing down on her. She had always known that her loyalty would be questioned if she ever strayed from the mission, but she had never imagined it would come to this, betrayal of her people, of everything she had ever known. But now, standing here with Liam, the lines between right and wrong seemed blurred. The trust she had for him was something Rowan and his soldiers could never understand. We don't answer to you, Rowan, Serena said, her voice low and filled with resolve. Not anymore. She turned to Liam, their eyes meeting in a shared understanding. They had fought together, survived together, and now, they would face whatever came next together. There was no turning back. The Nixon commander had shown his hand, revealing the true nature of the empire she had once sworn loyalty to. But now, her loyalty was with Liam. And it was stronger than anything Rowan could threaten. In that moment, the betrayal became clear. It wasn't just about her disobeying orders, it was about control. About fear. About a system that would stop at nothing to keep its grip on power, even if it meant eliminating those who threatened it. Serena had become a threat to them simply by choosing her own path, by choosing to believe in something that went beyond blind allegiance. Liam took a step forward, his eyes locked on Rowan with the steady gaze of a man who had nothing left to lose. I'm not leaving here without her, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. Rowan's smile faded, replaced by something darker, something dangerous. Then you'll die here with her. In that moment, everything shifted. The finality of Rowan's words hung in the air, and Serena knew that this wasn't just a simple betrayal. It was a declaration of war. The sound of movement in the trees behind her caught her attention just as the first Nixon soldier raised his weapon. She didn't need to see it, she could feel the danger, the shift in the air. Without thinking, Serena reached for her blade, drawing it in a single fluid motion. She felt the familiar rush of adrenaline surge through her veins, and though her heart pounded in her chest, she was calm. They had fought together before. They would fight together now. The Nixon soldiers advanced, their weapons raised, but Serena stood firm, her back to Liam's as they prepared for the fight of their lives. Rowan had made a grave mistake. He had underestimated them, underestimated the strength of the bond that had formed between them. He had brought his soldiers, but it would be he who would leave this place defeated. As the first soldier lunged forward, the battle began, not just for survival, but for the future of their alliance, for the freedom to choose their own path. And Serena and Liam were ready to face whatever came next, side by side. The weight of the moment hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as Serena stood at the precipice of an unthinkable choice. She had fought alongside Liam, trusted him with her life, and built something she never thought possible, a bond forged in the heat of battle, in the midst of shared survival. And yet, here she was, facing the impossible truth, her own people, the Nixon Empire, had betrayed her. Rovin's words still echoed in her ears, cutting deeper than any blade ever could. The venomous accusation that she had betrayed her people, that she had sided with the enemy, struck her with a force that made her stomach twist in discomfort. But more than the accusation, it was the realization that her allegiance was no longer to the empire she had sworn to protect. Her loyalty had shifted, silently but irrevocably, toward the man standing beside her. Liam was no longer just an outsider, he was her partner. A partner she couldn't abandon, even if it meant standing against everything she had ever known. As the Nixon soldiers closed in, their weapons drawn and their faces cold with determination, Serena felt a surge of protectiveness toward Liam. He was her only ally now, and she wouldn't let anyone take him from her. She had been trained to survive, to face threats with courage and skill, but nothing in her training had prepared her for the feeling of betrayal from her own people. The coldness in Rovin's eyes, the judgmental glances of the soldiers who had once stood by her side, cut deeper than any wound she had ever received. This was a betrayal of the highest order. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of all that had transpired. It wasn't just a battle for survival anymore. It was a fight for their very lives, their very futures. Serena's chest tightened as the reality of the situation set in. There was no going back. The Nixon Empire, which had once been her home, had now become her enemy. They had made it clear, there would be no mercy. She and Liam were expendable. But in that moment of overwhelming tension, something shifted inside Serena. The fear that had once threatened to swallow her whole was replaced by something else, a cold, clear understanding. Rovin and his soldiers weren't just enemies to be defeated. They represented a system, a way of life that no longer held meaning for her. They represented everything that had kept her confined, that had made her question her own sense of right and wrong. And now, they were the ones who would fall. The realization that her fight wasn't just for survival, but for something deeper, something far more significant, hit her like a lightning strike. This wasn't just about battling enemies in a foreign land, it was about choosing who she was, who she would become. The person she was before, the person who blindly followed orders, who trusted her people without question, was no longer who she was. She had been changed by her time with Liam, by the way he had shown her a different way of seeing the world, a way that didn't rely on fear, on control, on power. Liam, sensing the shift in her, looked at her, his eyes steady and filled with quiet resolve. He didn't need to speak. The look he gave her, one of understanding, of unwavering support, was enough. She could see it in his eyes, he wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for her, just as she was fighting for him. There was no fear in his gaze, no hesitation. He was ready for whatever came next, just as she was. And then it happened. Rovin's soldiers advanced, their weapons raised, their faces masks of indifference. The air around them hummed with the tension of impending violence. But Serena didn't move. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stood tall, her eyes locked on Rovin as he sneered at her from the front of his soldiers. The betrayal was still fresh, the sting of it sharp in her chest, but it no longer had the power to paralyze her. She wasn't just an agent of the Nixon Empire anymore. She was something else, someone who had fought for her beliefs, for the people she had come to care for. And if that meant standing against everything she had once known, so be it. Liam was the first to act. He moved with fluidity, his body a perfect blend of strength and precision. He closed the distance between him and the first soldier in seconds, his combat knife flashing in the dim light of the night. The soldier barely had time to react before Liam had him on the ground, incapacitated. The next soldier lunged at him, but Serena was already there, her weapon raised. The fight was chaotic, but there was an undeniable rhythm to it, a synchronization between them that could not be broken. They were partners, in every sense of the word. Serena fought with the precision of a trained warrior, but there was something else in her movements now, something more primal. It wasn't just about defeating the soldiers in front of her. It was about making them understand that she was no longer the person they had known. She was fighting for something that transcended duty, that went beyond loyalty to an empire that no longer deserved her allegiance. She was fighting for her own freedom, and for the freedom of the man she had come to trust with everything. The clash of weapons, the cries of pain, and the thundering pulse of her own heartbeat filled the night air. But despite the chaos, despite the blood and the violence, Serena felt a strange sense of clarity. The fear, the uncertainty, had melted away. She wasn't afraid of death. She wasn't afraid of losing herself in the battle. What terrified her now was the thought of losing Liam. Losing the one person who had shown her a different path, a path of survival that didn't rely on submission or fear. But as the battle raged on, it became clear that the Nixon soldiers were not going to give up easily. They were relentless, their attacks unyielding, and soon, the overwhelming numbers began to take their toll. Serena felt the first sting of a blade as it cut across her arm, the pain sharp but bearable. She barely had time to process the injury before she was dodging another soldier's strike, barely managing to parry his weapon in time. The adrenaline surged through her veins, pushing her to keep moving, to keep fighting. Liam's voice cut through the chaos, steady and commanding. "We need to fall back," he shouted, his voice rising above the din of battle. "Now." But there was no time for retreat. The enemy was closing in on them, and it was clear that they wouldn't make it out without a fight. Serena's body screamed for rest, for relief from the brutal combat, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. And then, as if to seal their fate, Rovan himself stepped forward, his eyes burning with fury. "This is your last mistake, Serena," he said coldly, his hand raised as he ordered his soldiers to press forward. "You will die here, with this human." But Serena didn't flinch. She didn't even hesitate. The years of loyalty to her people had been stripped away, leaving only the raw truth of who she was now. The woman who had stood by her own convictions, who had fought not for power, but for a future she could believe in. "I'm not your pawn anymore, Rovan," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "And I'll die fighting for the future I choose." With that, she moved toward him, and in the heat of the battle, in the chaos of the moment, she knew one thing: she would not let betrayal define her. She would define her own fate. In that instant, as the battle reached its peak, Serena knew that survival was no longer just about making it through the night. It was about making a stand, not just for herself, but for the man who had become her partner in the truest sense. And together, they would face whatever came next. Because betrayal, in the end, was just the beginning of a new chapter, one they would write together. The clash of steel and the roar of battle had subsided, leaving only the distant echoes of a war that had already begun to fade into the past. Serena stood in the aftermath, her body aching from the violence of the conflict, her breath shallow from the exertion. The ground around her was littered with the bodies of those who had once been her comrades, soldiers of the Nixon Empire who had been so certain of their power, their dominance. But now, they were nothing more than fallen shadows, scattered across the earth in the wake of a betrayal that had brought them to their end. In the distance, Liam stood watching her, his presence a quiet strength behind her. Their bond had been forged in the heat of battle, but it was something more than that now. It was something unspoken, something that had grown between them in ways neither of them had expected. They had fought side by side, survived together, and now they were standing at the precipice of something entirely new, a future that had been rewritten in the blood of those who had sought to destroy them. The Nixon Empire, the very institution she had pledged her life to, was in ruins, its leaders undone by their own arrogance. And Serena, who had once been an agent of that empire, now found herself questioning everything she had ever known. The loyalty she had felt to her people had been tested, and ultimately, it had been shattered. But in its place was something far more powerful: freedom. It was strange to feel it, this sense of freedom, after so many years of following orders, of adhering to the strictures of a regime that had promised safety but delivered nothing but control. She had been taught that loyalty was everything, that the empire was the foundation upon which all else was built. But in the face of betrayal, in the face of a truth she had never before allowed herself to see, she had come to understand that true loyalty was not to a government, not to an empire, but to the people who stood beside you when it mattered most. Liam. The name echoed in her mind, and she realized, as the dust of battle settled, that he was not just the man who had helped her survive. He was the man who had changed her. In the weeks since they had met, since they had been thrown together by fate, he had shown her something that had eluded her for so long, a future built not on duty, not on fear, but on trust, understanding, and partnership. The alliance they had formed in the face of overwhelming odds had evolved into something far more significant than either of them had anticipated. The last of the Nixon soldiers lay dead at their feet, and the threat that had once loomed over them was gone. But Serena knew that this was not the end of their journey. It was just the beginning. As she turned to Liam, she saw it in his eyes, the same realization. They had not only survived the battle, they had transformed the future. The world they had fought to protect, the lives they had fought to preserve, were theirs now. And they were free to shape them as they saw fit. Where do we go from here? Serena's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. The future stretched out before them, an open road with endless possibilities, but it was a road neither of them could navigate alone. Liam met her gaze, his expression filled with something deep, something beyond gratitude, beyond simple survival. It was a shared understanding that transcended words. Together, they had shattered the chains that had bound them. Together, they had faced the impossible and come out on the other side. And now, they stood at the threshold of a new world, one that they would create, not just for themselves, but for those who would follow. I don't know, Liam replied, his voice steady, but I know this: I'm not doing this without you. Serena felt something shift inside her at those words, a warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly seen, not just for her strength, her ability to fight, but for the person she had become. The person she had always wanted to be. She had spent so much of her life pretending to be something she was not, hiding behind the armor of duty, of loyalty to a cause that no longer had meaning. But now, standing here with Liam, she understood what it meant to truly be alive, to truly be free. A partnership. A true alliance. That was what they had become. Not just survivors, but creators of something new. Together, they could change the world they had once fought to protect. Together, they could rebuild. Serena took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that a new future was possible. She wasn't just an agent of the Nixon Empire anymore. She was an agent of change. "I think we start by making sure this doesn't happen again," she said, her voice firm, the leader inside her waking for the first time. "We make sure that the people who are left don't fall under the same systems that tried to destroy us. We make sure that the future we're building is one of freedom, equality, and trust." Liam nodded, his expression serious but filled with quiet confidence. "We'll do it together," he said, his voice resolute. "One step at a time." And with that, something inside Serena clicked into place. The pieces of her life, once scattered and uncertain, suddenly came together. The path was unclear, yes. The road ahead was fraught with challenges, dangers they couldn't yet anticipate. But for the first time, Serena knew that she was no longer walking it alone. The future, once a distant and uncertain thing, was now within their grasp. Together, they had rewritten it. They had taken the broken fragments of a past mired in betrayal and fear, and they had forged something new. As the sun began to rise, casting a soft, golden light over the horizon, Serena and Liam stood side by side, watching the world they had fought to save begin to stir. They had been through hell, but now they had the chance to build something different. Something better. Something that was theirs. The future was no longer a distant dream. It was a reality waiting to be shaped by their hands. And in that moment, Serena knew that whatever came next, whatever trials and tribulations they would face, she was ready. Because they were in it together. And that, more than anything, was the beginning of a future rewritten.